They say a storm doesn't just break things, it chooses who gets to begin again. In the frozen mountains of Montana, a homeless veteran named Mark Coleman was driving through a storm that seemed to erase every road behind him. Beside him sat Scout, his German Shepherd partner, trained in search and rescue, silent but alert, as if he could hear the land breathing under the ice. Mark wasn't looking for anything anymore. Not hope, not purpose, just distance from a past that refused to stay buried. Then, through the whiteout, a shape appeared. A crashed vehicle, half off the mountain road, headlights flickering like dying stars. And inside, a woman who had stopped believing anyone would ever come. Scout was the first to react, his body locking onto the scene, ears forward, a low warning rumble rising in his chest. Mark slammed the brakes, breath tightening, as the world narrowed to one impossible choice hidden inside the storm. And far beyond what he could see, a forgotten ranch waited under silence, as if the land itself had been holding its breath for him. No one yet knew why it had chosen him, or what it would demand in return. Tonight the wind had not eased. It only changed its voice, moving through the mountain pass like something ancient that refused to leave. Mark Coleman stood beside the half-frozen road, his breath turning to thin mist as he guided the woman carefully away from the edge of the storm. Scout remained close, circling once before settling into a watchful stance, his amber eyes scanning the white silence beyond the trees as if he expected the landscape itself to shift again. The woman, still steady in a way that surprised Mark, held onto his arm with quiet trust, her coat dusted with snow that melted into dark fabric beneath the fading stormlight. She did not ask questions, did not panic, only looked once toward the direction she had come from, as if confirming something only she understood. Mark led her toward his old pickup truck parked crookedly along the roadside, its engine still running, its headlights cutting weak tunnels through the snowfall. Inside the cab, warmth struggled against the cold as he helped her sit, carefully adjusting the blanket he always kept folded behind the seat. Scout jumped in next, settling near the passenger side door, his body angled between them and the unknown outside, his breathing slow but deliberate. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the storm tapping against metal and glass. The woman finally exhaled, her voice soft but clear, saying she did not think anyone would stop. Mark did not answer immediately. He had long stopped believing that stopping meant anything beyond instinct. He started the truck and eased it forward, tires crunching over snow that seemed to swallow the road behind them. As they drove, the world outside turned into a moving wall of white. But Scout never relaxed. His head remained slightly raised, ears shifting at invisible cues that Mark could not interpret. The woman gave her name as Eleanor Whitmore after several miles of silence, her tone carrying neither fear nor urgency, only memory. The name felt ordinary, yet something in the way she said it made Scout lift his head slightly, as if the sound carried weight beyond language. Mark noticed it but said nothing, focusing instead on the narrow road that seemed to appear and disappear with each turn. Eventually, a small structure came into view through the thinning storm, a weathered ranch house sitting at the edge of open land, its silhouette half swallowed by drifting snow. Eleanor's gaze lingered on it longer than necessary, her expression unchanged but distant, as if she had seen it before in a life that no longer belonged to her. Mark parked near the fence line, the engine idling as the wind pressed against the vehicle like a slow breath. Scout was the first to step out, landing carefully in the snow before pausing, nose low, tracking something invisible across the frozen ground. There was no sound, no movement, yet his attention fixed toward the ranch as though it had called him without speaking. Eleanor watched him quietly and said nothing, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket. Mark noticed the subtle tension in the air, the way the place seemed to hold stillness differently, as if it remembered footsteps that no longer existed. And in that quiet, standing between storm and silence, it felt as if the land itself had already begun recognizing them. The truck door closed with a soft metallic sound that seemed unusually loud in the quiet that followed the storm, as if the world itself had reduced its volume to listen. Mark Coleman stood for a moment beside the vehicle, feeling the cold air settle into his jacket while his eyes adjusted to the open land stretching before him. The ranch was larger than it first appeared, its fences weathered but still standing, its fields resting under a thin layer of melting snow that shimmered faintly under a fading gray sky. Nothing moved, yet everything felt aware, as if the land had been waiting through seasons for footsteps that had finally returned. Scout stepped forward first, his paws pressing into the soft ground with careful intention, his body low but steady, ears shifting with subtle precision. He moved in a slow arc toward the entrance of the property, not rushing, not hesitating, simply following something Mark could not see. Eleanor Whitmore remained near the truck, her hands still resting on the folded blanket, her gaze fixed on the ranch house, as though she were measuring time against memory. Mark approached her briefly, asking if she was certain about coming out in the cold, but she only gave a small nod, her voice calm as she said she had waited long enough to see it again. Those words lingered in Mark's mind as he turned back toward the ranch, following Scout across the uneven ground. The closer they moved toward the main house, the more Scout's behavior changed. His steps slowed, his head lowering slightly as he paused near the side of an old barn that leaned gently with age. He did not bark or growl. Instead, he stood still, focused on something within the wooden structure, as if listening to a frequency beneath human awareness. Mark placed a hand on the barn door, feeling the faint vibration of wind slipping through cracks in the wood. But there was something else, a subtle irregularity that made him pause longer than expected. He pushed the door open with effort, revealing a dim interior filled with old farming equipment, dust-covered tools, and forgotten traces of labor that once shaped the land. Sunlight filtered through narrow gaps in the wood, casting thin lines across the floor that made the space feel divided between past and present. Scout moved inside first, circling slowly, then stopping near a corner where the ground sounded different beneath his weight. Mark knelt down, pressing his hand against the boards, noticing a hollow resonance beneath the surface. It was not loud, not obvious, but steady in a way that suggested space where there should have been earth. Eleanor appeared at the barn entrance without him noticing, her presence quiet but deliberate. She watched Mark carefully as he stood again, his attention fixed on the floor. For a long moment, she said nothing, as if waiting for him to reach his own conclusion. Finally, she spoke in a tone that carried both restraint and acceptance, mentioning that parts of the ranch had been sealed for many years, not out of fear, but out of necessity she never fully explained. Her words were not warnings, but acknowledgments of something already in motion. Scout let out a low, controlled sound, stepping back from the corner as if confirming what he had already sensed. Mark looked between the dog and Eleanor, feeling an unfamiliar weight in the silence, as though the ranch itself was not simply land, but a memory layered beneath soil and timber. The wind moved through the barn again, carrying with it a faint shift in temperature, and in that moment, standing between what was visible and what was hidden, Mark understood that nothing about this place had been left behind by accident. The air inside the barn felt different as Mark Coleman stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the wooden slats above. Dust particles drifted slowly through the air like suspended memories, moving whenever the wind outside shifted across the open fields. Scout remained near the corner of the structure, his posture unchanged, focused on the same section of floor, as if time itself was slightly misaligned beneath it. Mark knelt again, pressing his palm against the worn wood, feeling a subtle hollow space beneath that responded with a quiet resonance, not loud enough to be alarming, but too structured to be natural decay. He shifted his weight and listened carefully, his military instincts returning in ways he had long tried to forget, analyzing patterns in silence, in stillness, in the language of spaces that should not sound the way they did. Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore finally stepped inside the barn, her presence quiet, almost hesitant, as though crossing an invisible boundary she had avoided for years. Her eyes followed Mark's hand on the floor, then briefly moved to Scout, who had not moved at all, as if confirming something she already knew was unavoidable. The wind outside strengthened for a moment, passing through the gaps in the walls, causing the structure to breathe in a slow, uneven rhythm that seemed to match the sensation beneath the floorboards. Mark stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands, turning toward Eleanor and asking in a calm voice if this part of the barn had always been sealed or modified. She hesitated before answering, her gaze drifting toward a far corner where old tools hung untouched, and she explained that the ranch had once been larger, but parts of it were closed off after a long time for reasons she never fully shared with anyone outside her family. Her voice carried no fear, only memory, as if she were describing something that had already accepted its place in history. Scout suddenly shifted his position again, moving 2 steps forward, then stopping directly over the hollow point, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched the wood. Mark watched carefully, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle deeper, not as fear, but as recognition that something intentional had been preserved beneath them. He reached for a nearby rusted tool and gently tapped the floor, producing a deeper sound that confirmed the empty space below. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if hearing the sound triggered something long kept silent within her. When she spoke again, her words were slower, acknowledging that there were sections of the ranch her late husband had insisted remain untouched, sealed behind layers of time and trust. She did not elaborate further, but the way she said it suggested that what lay beneath was not forgotten, only waiting. Mark looked down at Scout, who remained steady, unwavering, as though the dog had already accepted what the barn was hiding long before any human understanding caught up. The silence between them grew heavier, not from fear, but from the realization that the land they were standing on held more than soil and wood. It held intention, and perhaps a reason for calling them there at all. The silence inside the barn deepened in a way that felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened around Mark Coleman and refused to move. He stood still for a moment longer, letting his eyes trace the outline of the worn wooden floor, carefully studying the seams between each plank as though they might reveal a hidden logic. Scout remained fixed in place, his attention unwavering, but now his posture had changed slightly, less alert and more focused, as if he had confirmed something internally and was simply waiting for action to follow understanding. Eleanor Whitmore stood a few feet behind Mark, her hands clasped together at waist level, her expression calm but distant, like someone watching a memory slowly surface after years of silence. Mark finally exhaled and stepped closer to the corner Scout had chosen, lowering himself to one knee again. This time he placed both hands on the floor, applying gentle pressure along different points, feeling for inconsistencies in resistance. One of the boards responded differently, not loose, but suspended, as if resting above empty space rather than solid ground. He looked up briefly toward Eleanor, asking if there had ever been repairs in this section of the barn. She hesitated for a long moment before answering, saying that her late husband had always handled maintenance alone in this part of the property and never allowed anyone else to interfere with it. Her voice carried no urgency, only acceptance, as though she had made peace with not understanding everything she lived beside. Mark shifted his weight and carefully pressed the edge of the plank again, this time hearing a faint hollow echo that confirmed what Scout had already sensed. The realization did not bring surprise as much as clarity, like a pattern finally completing itself. He stood slowly and moved toward the wall, scanning the interior structure, noticing subtle irregularities in the alignment of the beams that suggested a space behind them. Scout followed, stopping directly beside him, his head tilted slightly upward, eyes fixed on a section of wood that appeared older than the surrounding structure. Mark reached out and ran his fingers along the vertical support beam, feeling a slight draft where air should not have been moving. Without speaking, he pressed against the beam with controlled force, and after a brief moment of resistance, a faint shift occurred, not dramatic, but deliberate, like something long designed to remain hidden, finally acknowledging pressure from the outside. Eleanor stepped forward instinctively, not in alarm, but in recognition, as though she had always known this moment would come, just not when. The barn responded with a subtle mechanical sound, aged hinges or concealed joints adjusting after years of stillness, revealing a narrow seam between wall and structure. Mark paused, looking once more at Eleanor, silently asking for confirmation. She nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting something between relief and resignation, and said that there were parts of the ranch her husband called closed ground, places that were never meant to be part of daily life, only preserved. With careful movement, Mark applied pressure again, and a section of the wall shifted inward slightly, revealing a darkened passage beyond it, not deep, but clearly intentional in design. Scout stepped forward without hesitation, placing one paw inside the opening first, then his head, as if confirming safety through instinct alone. The air coming from the passage was cooler, carrying a faint stillness that did not belong to the barn above it. Mark did not enter immediately. Instead, he stood at the threshold, understanding that whatever lay beyond had been waiting longer than any of them had been alive. Eleanor's voice broke the silence gently, saying she had not seen that space in many years, and that her husband believed. Some things should only be opened by the right person at the right time. Mark looked at her, then at Scout, then finally into the darkness, realizing that whatever definition of right person had been used, it had somehow led to him standing here now. Mark Coleman hesitated at the threshold of the narrow passage, letting his eyes adjust to the darker space beyond the barn wall. The air that drifted out was noticeably cooler, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time, as if nothing inside had breathed for years. Scout stepped in first without waiting for permission, his body lowering slightly as he moved forward with deliberate caution, each step measured and controlled. Mark followed slowly, using his hand along the wooden frame for balance, feeling the texture shift from rough barn timber to something older, smoother, almost intentionally preserved. Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore remained at the entrance, not entering but watching, her presence steady yet distant, as if she had already walked this path in memory long before returning physically. The passage was narrow at first, forcing them into a single line of movement, but it gradually opened into a wider interior space that defied expectation. Mark paused when he realized the floor beneath him was not dirt or simple foundation, but reinforced wood, carefully maintained despite its hidden position. Scout moved ahead a few more steps, then stopped, lifting his head slightly, as if acknowledging something unseen but familiar. The faint sound of distant wind no longer matched the barn above. Instead, there was a muted quiet here, insulated and deliberate. Mark knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dust, revealing clean boards underneath, far better preserved than anything in the outer structure. This was not abandonment, it was protection. Eleanor's voice finally came from behind the entrance, soft and controlled, saying that her husband had called this place the quiet ground, a section of the ranch never meant for daily life, only for preservation of what mattered most. Mark looked back at her, noticing for the first time a subtle shift in her expression, not fear, but recognition mixed with acceptance, as if she had finally reached the part of the story she had long avoided speaking aloud. Scout moved again, this time toward the center of the hidden space, where the floorboards formed a square outline slightly different in color and alignment from the rest. Mark approached carefully and placed his hand over the marked section, feeling a faint temperature difference beneath the surface, cooler and more stable than the surrounding area. He pressed gently along the edges, tracing what appeared to be a sealed hatch integrated seamlessly into the flooring. There was no handle visible, no obvious mechanism, only precise craftsmanship designed to remain unnoticed unless deliberately sought. For a long moment, no one spoke, and even the barn above seemed distant, as if separated by more than physical distance. Scout let out a low, steady breath, not a warning, but a signal of confirmation, as though he understood the significance of what lay beneath. Mark stood slowly, his focus narrowing as he studied the structure, realizing that this was not a simple hidden compartment, but a deliberate separation from the life above. Eleanor finally stepped 1 foot inside the passage, stopping just behind him, her voice quieter now as she admitted that her husband had always said some things on the ranch were never meant to be found by chance, only by purpose. Mark looked down at the sealed floor again, feeling the weight of that idea settle into him, not as mystery alone, but as invitation, as if the ranch itself had been waiting for someone willing to listen closely enough to open what time had carefully preserved. Mark Coleman stood over the sealed floor panel, feeling the weight of silence settle deeper, as if the hidden space beneath him was aware of being observed. The barn above no longer felt like the center of anything. Instead, it seemed like a thin layer separating him from something carefully preserved for a reason. Scout remained motionless near the edge of the marked square, his head lowered, eyes fixed on a single point, as though confirming what instinct had already concluded. Eleanor Whitmore stood just behind Mark, her presence quieter now, her expression carrying a stillness that suggested acceptance rather than surprise, as if she had always known this moment would eventually arrive. Mark knelt again and traced the outline of the panel with his fingers, noticing the precision of its construction, the way the seams were almost invisible, designed to blend seamlessly into the structure above. He applied gentle pressure along one edge, then another, carefully testing resistance, until a faint mechanical shift echoed upward through the wood, subtle but unmistakable. The sound was not loud, but it carried intention, like something acknowledging that it had been found. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly, as though the sound itself carried memory she had not accessed in years. She finally spoke, her voice low, explaining that her husband had always insisted this section of the ranch remain untouched, not out of fear, but out of responsibility, as if protecting something that could not be explained in simple terms. Mark looked at her, trying to understand the weight behind her words, but she offered no further clarification, only a quiet acknowledgement that some decisions were never meant to be revisited until the right moment arrived. Scout suddenly shifted again, stepping closer to the center of the panel, his paws aligning almost perfectly with its hidden boundaries. He let out a single controlled breath, then lowered his body slightly, as if signaling readiness rather than caution. Mark placed both hands firmly on the panel this time and pressed downward with measured force. For a brief moment, nothing happened, and then the floor responded with a soft release, a hidden latch giving way beneath years of stillness. A faint outline separated from the surrounding wood, revealing a narrow seam that had not been visible before. The air that rose from the opening was cooler, carrying the sensation of depth rather than emptiness, as if the space below had maintained its own condition independent of the world above. Eleanor stepped forward one pace, stopping just behind Mark's shoulder, her voice steady as she said that there were no records of what lay beneath, only instructions to preserve it, until someone arrived who would understand its purpose. Mark glanced down at Scout, who remained focused on the opening, his posture calm but deliberate, as though waiting for permission that did not need to be spoken. Slowly, Mark reached for the edge of the panel and lifted it just enough to reveal darkness beneath, not empty, but structured, as if constructed space extended further than expected. The ranch above suddenly felt lighter, as if a portion of its history had shifted into view. Eleanor did not move, but her expression changed subtly, suggesting that whatever had been hidden for so long was no longer contained by silence alone, but by choice that had finally reached its conclusion. Mark Coleman slowly lowered the panel further, allowing the opening beneath the ranch to widen just enough for a controlled view into the darkness below. The air rising from the space was noticeably cooler, carrying a stillness that felt undisturbed for a long time, as if the underground structure had been sealed away from every season above it. Scout stood at the edge of the opening, his body perfectly still, eyes fixed downward without hesitation, not showing fear or curiosity, only confirmation. Eleanor Whitmore remained behind Mark, her presence steady but distant, her gaze lowered toward the opening, as if she was observing something she had once promised never to disturb. Mark adjusted his position carefully and directed a small beam of light from his phone into the space below, revealing a narrow set of wooden steps descending into structured darkness. The craftsmanship was deliberate, not crude or forgotten, but maintained in a way that suggested intention rather than abandonment. Each step was evenly spaced, reinforced with aged but preserved timber, leading deeper than expected beneath the ranch. The walls were lined with reinforced panels, and faint markings could be seen along the edges, not decorative, but functional, as if guiding someone through a space designed for continuity rather than concealment. Mark paused at the top of the descent, studying the structure with quiet focus, realizing this was not a simple basement or storage area, but something engineered with precision. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice softer than before, explaining that her late husband had called it the quiet foundation, a place built not to hide from the world, but to protect something meant to outlast it. Her words carried no urgency, only finality, as though she had accepted its existence as part of the land's history rather than its present. Scout moved first, placing one paw onto the top step, then another, descending slowly without hesitation. Mark followed carefully, one step at a time, feeling the temperature shift further as they moved below ground level. The air became more stable, less affected by wind or weather, creating an unnatural sense of isolation that felt intentional. As they descended, the sound of the ranch above faded completely, replaced by a faint hum of structural stillness, like a space preserved in suspension. When they reached the lower level, Mark stopped and looked around, illuminating a wider chamber than expected. The room was not empty. It contained organized structures, sealed sections, and carefully maintained surfaces that suggested long-term preparation rather than temporary use. Everything was orderly, as if someone had designed it to remain unchanged regardless of time passing above. Scout stood at the center of the chamber, turning slowly once, then fixing his gaze toward a far wall where faint outlines suggested additional sealed compartments. Eleanor reached the bottom last, her hand briefly touching the wooden rail before she let it go, her expression calm but distant, as though she was witnessing something she had once chosen to forget in order to live above it. Mark lowered his light further into the space, realizing that the ranch was not simply inherited land, but a layered structure of memory, intention, and preservation, waiting for someone to finally understand that what had been buried here was never meant to stay hidden forever. The underground chamber felt quieter than any place Mark Coleman had ever experienced, not because it lacked sound, but because it seemed to absorb it before it could form into anything meaningful. He stood in the center of the space, slowly turning in. Place with the faint light from his phone illuminating rows of carefully preserved structures, sealed compartments, and organized sections that stretched farther than the initial entrance had suggested. Nothing here felt abandoned. Everything felt maintained, as if time had been managed rather than endured. Scout moved ahead with steady confidence, circling once before stopping near a reinforced wall panel where faint markings suggested repeated access points that had since been sealed. Eleanor Whitmore remained near the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the wooden rail, her posture unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something deeper now, a recognition that carried both closure and acceptance. Mark approached one of the sealed compartments and ran his hand along its surface, noticing the precision of its construction, the intentional layering of materials designed not only for protection but for continuity. This was not a hidden space created out of fear. It was built with purpose, as if someone had anticipated the need for preservation long before it became necessary. He turned toward Eleanor and asked quietly if she had ever fully known what her husband had built beneath the ranch. She took a long breath before answering, her voice calm but weighted, saying that she had known enough to trust it, but never enough to interfere with it. She explained that her husband had spoken often about responsibility, about preparing something that would only reveal itself when the right presence arrived, not through ownership, but through character. Mark listened without interrupting, feeling the meaning of her words settle into the stillness around them. Scout suddenly shifted his focus again, moving toward a corner where a smaller, less visible panel was embedded into the wall. Unlike the others, this one carried no obvious markings, only a subtle alignment that suggested intentional concealment within concealment. Mark followed and knelt beside it, studying the edges carefully before applying light pressure. The panel responded with a soft release, revealing a narrow compartment inside. Within it were documents, maps, and carefully preserved records, all arranged. With deliberate order, he retrieved one of the folders and opened it slowly, scanning its contents under the dim light. The pages detailed land boundaries, historical transfers, and long-term stewardship instructions that extended far beyond a single lifetime. There was no mention of wealth in the conventional sense, no sudden fortune or hidden vault, but something more structured, more enduring, a legacy built on protection of land, resources, and continuity of care. Eleanor stepped closer as Mark read, her expression softening slightly, as though seeing the written proof of something she had always felt but never confirmed. Scout sat quietly now, no longer searching, simply observing, as if his role in confirming truth had already been fulfilled. Mark lowered the document slightly, looking around the chamber again with a different understanding. The ranch above was not simply inherited property, nor was the underground space a secret meant to be uncovered for reward. It was a system of trust, preserved across time, waiting for someone willing to carry it forward with responsibility rather than possession. Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice steady, saying that her husband believed land remembered the hands that treated it well, and that one day it would recognize the right person without needing explanation. Mark remained silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of that idea settle not as obligation, but as direction. Around them, the chamber remained unchanged, yet everything about how it was seen had shifted. In that quiet underground space, beneath a ranch that had waded through years of silence, Mark understood that what had been left behind was not simply inheritance, but trust, carefully placed into time, waiting not to be claimed, but to be continued.